Chris Jericho has built one of the most celebrated careers in professional wrestling, defined by constant reinvention, tireless work ethic, and an unshakable determination to stay relevant across decades. From his early days in Mexico to headlining in WCW, WWE, NJPW, and AEW, Jericho has proven time and again that he has the creativity and grit to remain at the top of the business. Along the way, however, Jericho has clashed with a number of wrestlers backstage and in the ring. Some of these conflicts were rooted in professional jealousy, others in personality clashes, and a few turned into genuine animosity that spilled over into the public eye. Let's take a look at the wrestlers Chris Jericho truly couldn't stand working with, and the stories behind those real-life feuds. Vampiro Jericho's first brush with genuine animosity came during his time in Mexico, wrestling for EMLL, today's CMLL, under the name Corazon de Leon. At the time, Vampiro was already an established star, beloved by Mexican fans for his striking look and charismatic presence. While the two men shared similarities, both Canadian, both music lovers, both foreigners breaking into the Mexican scene, Jericho felt that Vampiro viewed him as competition. In his autobiography, Jericho accused Vampiro of being two-faced, acting friendly in person but quietly working to undermine him behind the scenes. According to Jericho, Vampiro resented the push Jericho was receiving from the company and saw his rising popularity as a threat. Jericho later admitted that the more time he spent around Vampiro, the more he disliked him, eventually concluding that he simply didn't want to be anywhere near him. Vampiro, however, has always brushed off those claims, saying he barely remembers Jericho during that period and dismissing him as irrelevant to his own career. Over time, Vampiro even mocked Jericho publicly, particularly ridiculing his music career with Fozzy and calling him a poser. Though the two never actually wrestled each other, the mutual disdain became part of Jericho's early struggle for respect in a foreign land. It set the tone for a career where Jericho had to constantly fight against both perception and politics to prove he belonged at the top. Goldberg. Perhaps Jericho's most famous feud outside the ring was with Bill Goldberg during their WCW days. Goldberg was WCW's unstoppable powerhouse, booked as a near-mythical figure with a massive winning streak, while Jericho was a rising cruiserweight trying to break into the mid-card. Jericho, ever the strategist, saw opportunity in a David versus Goliath storyline. His idea was simple: mock Goldberg week after week until it led to a short squash match on pay-per-view where Goldberg would destroy him in seconds. The plan wouldn't just give Goldberg another dominant win, it would also raise Jericho's profile. For weeks, Jericho delivered entertaining promos, parading a fake Goldberg to the ring and claiming the real one was scared of him. Fans ate it up, but Goldberg himself wasn't on board. He didn't like the comedic angle and refused to work with Jericho, believing it diminished his aura. As a result, the feud fizzled before it could pay off. Jericho was furious, feeling robbed of a chance to elevate himself. Years later, he admitted to holding resentment and often criticized Goldberg publicly as someone who didn't respect the business. The tension carried over into WWE in 2003 when Goldberg joined the company. Their dislike boiled over in a backstage altercation where Goldberg confronted Jericho, allegedly grabbing him by the throat. Jericho, undersized but trained in grappling, managed to take Goldberg down with a front face lock before others broke it up. They eventually shook hands and agreed to move forward, but the bad blood lingered, and the incident became one of the most talked about backstage fights of the era. Kevin Nash and Scott Hall Jericho's frustrations in WCW weren't limited to Goldberg. Much of it stemmed from the overall locker room culture, dominated by the cliques Kevin Nash and Scott Hall. Both men wielded significant influence behind the scenes and often used their power to protect their own spots at the expense of younger talent. Nash, in particular, made headlines for dismissing the cruiserweights: Jericho, Rey Mysterio, Dean Malenko, Eddie Guerrero, and others, as vanilla midgets. For a group delivering some of the best matches on the card, the insult stung. Jericho recalled one encounter with Scott Hall that encapsulated the problem. Hall looked him dead in the eye and said, "Nobody's coming to see you. Just do your 5 minutes and get out." Jericho, stunned by the arrogance, stood up for himself. With encouragement from his friend Scott Norton, Jericho told Hall to never speak to him like that again. Hall brushed it off as a joke, but Jericho refused to laugh along. Years later, Jericho admitted he never warmed to Hall, acknowledging his talent but condemning his arrogance. Nash, too, remained a sore point, with Jericho occasionally mocking him in interviews and promos. The experience reinforced Jericho's belief that WCW was never going to give him the respect he deserved, fueling his decision to leave for the WWF in 1999. Larry Zbyszko. It wasn't just the wrestlers in WCW who made Jericho's life difficult. Even the commentary team sometimes undercut his credibility. Larry Zbyszko, a former AWA world champion turned commentator, often emphasized Jericho's small size compared to the company's giants like Hulk Hogan and Kevin Nash. Jericho later wrote that Zbyszko was one of the worst commentators he'd ever worked with because instead of elevating the younger talent, he reinforced the idea that only the biggest wrestlers mattered. For Jericho, who was working tirelessly to prove that cruiserweights could be taken seriously, hearing that narrative on commentary was deeply frustrating. While there was never a physical altercation between the two, Jericho's disdain for Zbyszko reflected his larger frustrations with WCW's toxic environment. To Jericho, the commentary booth's dismissiveness was just another obstacle he had to overcome. One more reason why he eventually realized WCW was never going to let him break through. China Jericho's transition to WWF should have been a fresh start, but it came with its own challenges. One of his earliest programs was with China for the Intercontinental Championship. While the storyline was high profile, Jericho later admitted it was one of the most frustrating experiences of his career. In interviews, he described China as stiff and difficult to work with, saying her lack of technical training made their matches awkward. He recalled moments when she was out of position or hit too hard, forcing him to adjust on the fly. Jericho also felt he never got the credit he deserved for carrying the matches and making her look strong. The tension peaked when China suffered a black eye after one match, which Jericho insists was an accident, but it became a major issue backstage. For Jericho, it was a tough introduction to WWF politics, being placed in a major storyline but feeling handcuffed by an opponent he didn't believe was ready for that level. Despite the frustration, the feud helped establish Jericho on television, but he never hid the fact that working with China was among his least favorite experiences. Triple H. Jericho's issues with Triple H are less about physical matches and more about politics and presentation. In December 2001, Jericho achieved what should have been the biggest moment of his career, becoming the first ever undisputed WWF champion. by defeating The Rock and Stone Cold Steve Austin in the same night. But instead of being presented as the new top star, Jericho's reign was overshadowed by the ongoing storyline between Triple H and Stephanie McMahon. At the time, the two were playing out an on-screen divorce, and Jericho was slotted in as Stephanie's ally, effectively becoming a background player in their drama despite holding the company's most prestigious title. Jericho later said it was demoralizing to be treated like Stephanie's lackey when he should have been portrayed as the champion. When WrestleMania 8 rolled around, Jericho walked into the main event as champion, but was positioned as little more than an obstacle in Triple H's redemption story. Unsurprisingly, he lost the title, and his reign is remembered as one of the weakest in history. Jericho has openly blamed Triple H's politicking for minimizing his role. And while both men have since moved on, it's clear that Jericho views that period as one of the most disappointing chapters of his career. CM Punk decades later, Jericho found himself in a leadership role in AEW, but that didn't shield him from more conflict. When CM Punk arrived in 2021, it was a massive moment for AEW, but within a year, Punk's outspoken nature led to major backstage drama. At the infamous All Out 2022 press conference, Punk blasted the Elite, Hangman Page, and AEW's management, sparking a physical altercation backstage that became front-page wrestling news. Jericho, who had worked hard to maintain harmony in the AEW locker room, was furious. Reports say he confronted Punk afterward, calling him a cancer to the locker room and a detriment to the company. While Punk's supporters defended his right to speak out, Jericho felt his behavior jeopardized the entire company. The two traded subtle jabs in interviews and online afterward, with Jericho positioning himself as the veteran trying to keep the locker room together while Punk was seen as the disruptor. Though both men are world-class performers, their clash revealed just how fragile the balance of egos can be in modern wrestling. MVP Jericho's issues with MVP are more recent and less tied to in-ring work, but no less personal. The tension began on social media, where the two traded insults. Things escalated when both were present on Jericho's Rock and Wrestling Rager at Sea Cruise, where reports suggest they had a heated confrontation that may have turned physical. While the details remain murky, the bad blood didn't fade. Years later, in 2022, MVP visited AEW talent at a hotel where Jericho was staying. Witnesses say Jericho approached him to discuss their issues, but MVP wasn't interested. Instead, he challenged Jericho to step outside for a fight. Rather than escalate, Jericho walked into the elevator, and just before the doors closed, he reportedly told MVP, "I don't fight jobbers." The insult reignited their feud, and though it hasn't played out on television, it remains one of Jericho's most memorable recent conflicts, showing that even after decades in the business, he hasn't lost his knack for stirring things up. Closing thoughts. Chris Jericho has never been afraid to speak his mind, and throughout his long career, that honesty has created enemies as well as respect. From early clashes with Vampiro in Mexico to physical confrontations with Goldberg and heated disagreements with Triple H, China, CM Punk, and MVP, Jericho's journey has been marked by battles both inside and outside the ring. But these conflicts also shaped who he became, a performer who stood up for himself, who refused to be disrespected, and who demanded to be seen as a main event player. Today, Jericho is recognized not only as one of wrestling's greatest reinvention artists, but also as a man who never let anyone else define his career. His feuds may have been personal, but they also fueled his drive to succeed. And that determination is part of what made Chris Jericho a true legend.